What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back. As always, thank you for joining me. My name is Paul Brettel. Today we're here to discuss why I think the cornerback position, out of the needs that the Packers have to address this offseason, is the one where we could see Brian Gutekunst and the Packers take a swing in free agency, try to bring in one of the more high-profile options that are out there, and we're going to discuss why I think that could be the case. But first, before we do all that, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work, including the article version of what we're discussing here today, over at ESPNLacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports radio fans, Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. So like I said, of the big needs that the Packers have to tackle this offseason, I think if they're going to take a swing, if they're going to try to make a splash in free agency here in a few weeks, it's going to be at cornerback over the defensive line, over the wide receiver positions. And in part, contributing to why I think that's the case is the level of uncertainty that's at the cornerback position compared to those other two position groups. Again, the pass rush absolutely has to improve. I fully anticipate, and I'll highlight a little bit more here in a little bit, the Packers and Gutekunst adding to the defensive front. But if they don't, you still have Rashawn Gary, Lucas Van Ness, Brenton Cox, Enoch Barry, Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, right? You still have a strong foundation. Same thing at receiver. Could they benefit from an addition? Sure. But if they don't, the Packers still have Romeo Doubs. They still have Dontavian Wicks. They still have Jaden Reed. Christian Watson will obviously return at some point next season. At both of those position groups, again, improved play is needed in 2025 if the Packers are going to accomplish their goals. Improved play is needed from both those position groups. But there's a strong foundation at those positions because of the players mentioned that isn't there at the cornerback spot right now. There's more uncertainty within the cornerback position than there are at those other two groups, and I think that could lead to, in part, an added sense of urgency to add to that position group over the others. And again, I'll expound on that here in a few minutes. But as we look at what the current shape outlook of the Packers cornerback room is, I'm sure as everyone has heard, the Packers, according to Ian Rappaport, are open to trading cornerback Jaire Alexander. And really, it just felt like it was a matter of time before we were going to get to this point, right? I mean, after the season, it was reported that Jaire told some reporters during locker room cleanout day that he didn't want to speak to anyone. He didn't have anything good to say. Didn't know if he was going to be on the team this upcoming offseason. And then just recently this week at the NFL Combine, Brian Gutekunst was asked about Jaire Alexander's future and said, yeah, we'll see. Anytime a general manager says we'll see when asked about the status of a player and their contract and moving forward into a new season, that's not a yes. That's very much closer to the no of whether or not they will return. And then a day later, the Ian Rappaport report about the Packers open to trading Jaire Alexander came out. So again, we still have to see how this all unfolds, but it is very much looking like Jaire Alexander is not going to be on the Green Bay Packers in 2025. In addition to not having Jaire potentially, Eric Stokes is an upcoming free agent. And so of those who are currently under contract, again, we'll exclude Jaire for the purpose of this conversation, those currently under contract right now at the cornerback position for the Packers, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine, Kamal Hadden, Kalen King, Caleb Hayes, and Isaiah Dunn. Excluding Nixon and Valentine, so Hadden, King, Hayes, and Dunn, Isaiah Dunn's 116 defensive snaps over the last 4 seasons is the most among that group. The Packers need depth, they need experience, and they need competition for Keyshawn Nixon and Carrington Valentine for those starting spots. As we rewind a year ago, I still remember before the Combine, before the draft, and then going through the summer with Matt LaFleur in training camp and OTAs, the Packers, throughout this last year, they've been really, really bullish about the cornerback depth that they have. It's why we just didn't see the Packers add to the cornerback room last year until the 7th round of the draft. It's why even during the trade deadline, we didn't see the Packers dip their toe into the cornerback market. They like the guys, Nixon and Valentine specifically for this conversation, that they have in that room. They are clearly much higher on those two than what I think the external, outside the building, general consensus is about Nixon and about Valentine. Some of the things that we've heard, whether it's Jeff Hafley or Brian Gutekunst mention when describing Keyshawn Nixon's play is, Gutekunst spoke about at the Combine how great of a fit Keyshawn Nixon is for Jeff Hafley's system. Called him a competitor. We've heard Jeff Hafley talk about how helpful he is as a run defender, his soundness as a tackler, his improved play as the season went on in man coverage. Brian Gutekunst talked about Keyshawn Nixon's awareness, his eyes. They really like what Keyshawn Nixon brings to the table, what he adds to that Packers cornerback room. And last season, he allowed a 66% completion rate on 86 targets, allowed pass catchers, and this is an impressive number, to just 9.3 yards per catch. That was the 7th fewest among boundary cornerbacks last season. Anytime you have a boundary cornerback who's giving up fewer than 10 yards per catch, that's a really, really low number. That's a good number for your cornerback to have. Nixon also had 6 pass breakups and an interception, according to Pro Football Focus, in terms of on-ball production. So again, for the reasons mentioned, the Packers do like what they have in Keyshawn Nixon. With Carrington Valentine, he earned that cornerback 2 role as the season progressed, especially towards that last month of the season. He had 2 interceptions in the last 4 games. In 5 of his last 6 games, again, we referenced the under 10 yards per catch allowed. In 5 of those final 6 games, Valentine allowed under 11 yards completion. So him and Nixon both did a good job of limiting explosive plays, limiting big play opportunities for opposing offenses. And Matt LaFleur said of Valentine, he just keeps getting better. They saw that progression from him as the season went on, as he got more healthy, as he got more reps and experience within Jeff Hafley's defense. So for the reasons mentioned, the lack of depth, the lack of experience depth, those are absolutely reasons that the Packers have to address the cornerback position. And there's going to be competition for Nixon and Valentine. Competition, not only at cornerback, but over the last 2 years, has been the catalyst behind how this Packers team made such a drastic turnaround as they transitioned from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, from being one of the youngest team in the NFL for 2 seasons. And Brian Gutekunst spoke a lot about that competition element last offseason and just how crucial that was for the growth of this young Packers team. So I don't expect him to deviate whatsoever from wanting to infuse that element throughout the roster and at the cornerback position. But having said that, I think, and compared to how the current Packers cornerback room is viewed, again, externally outside of the building, with Nixon and Valentine being the top 2 options right now, again, assuming Jaire Alexander is traded, the Packers do not feel that way. Again, not to say that they don't believe competition's needed. I fully expect them to add it, but they are obviously much, much more bullish, much higher on those 2 currently leading the room, and I think what the general outside opinion is. Now, having said all that, the Packers cannot keep the status quo as is going into 2025 with this cornerback room. Again, from a bare minimum perspective, they need more players in this cornerback room. They need more experience depth behind Nixon and Valentine than what they have. And as already discussed, they need to bring in competition for Valentine and Nixon. Neither of those players should just be handed starting time next season. It should have to be earned. And while, as mentioned, neither player gave up too many big plays. Even without Jaire Alexander on the field for a decent portion of last season, this Packers secondary, the cornerbacks, they did a really, really good job of limiting downfield plays. There weren't a lot of those plays where you saw the receivers getting behind the Packers cornerback, big completions being made down the field. Again, they did a very good job in that respect. However, big areas of improvement. One, besides Xavier McKinney at the safety position and his interceptions, his on-ball production, Packers were one of the worst teams in football in terms of pass deflections. In terms of total pass deflections, according to Pro Football Reference, the Packers ranked 31st last season. Their cornerback position just did not generate a lot of plays on the football last year. In addition to that, while Nixon and Valentine did a good job of limiting yards per reception, Nixon's completion rate was at 66%. Valentine's completion rate was at just under 82%. Even if you're only giving up 9, 10 yards per catch, which again, for a boundary cornerback, it's really good. But even if you're giving up only that amount, but you're surrendering a completion, in Nixon's case, 3 out of every 4 passes that come your way. Or in Valentine's case, 4 out of every 5 completions that are coming your way, even at 9, 10 yards a pop, that's a first down. The offense is moving the chains. The offense is staying on the field. The offense is putting together long, sustainable drives. So again, those are really the big areas of improvement. We need more on-ball production. We need more forced incompletions from this Packers cornerback room. And again, when you factor in the need for competition for those two, the need for depth, the need for experience on this roster, the recipe is 100% there for, especially when you combine free agency and the draft from a roster construction approach, for the Packers to not only double dip, I think we could potentially see them triple dip, adding 2-3 cornerbacks to this roster this offseason. And when it comes to free agency specifically, from a spending what the Packers have available salary cap wise, they absolutely have the means to go out, whether it's cornerback or whatever position it might be. They absolutely have the means to go out and take a swing this offseason and try to bring in, again, a more high-profile addition. That ability's there. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? We got to see how the Packers, Brian Gutekunst, evaluate the prospects that are out there. There's obviously other teams competing for these players, these free agents, to try to bring them in as well. But from just a pure salary cap perspective, what's available to the Packers to spend? In that regard, they very much have the ability to make an addition. And a few videos back, I went high-level overview diving into the Packers salary cap situation. So be sure to check that out. Now, why do I think in free agency the priority is going to be cornerback? One, for the reasons mentioned. All the reasons that we just discussed. The level of uncertainty at this position compared to the defensive line, compared to receiver, far, far greater than at those two position groups. But in addition to that, I think there's just a greater opportunity in terms of the paths, the avenues that are out there for the Packers to add to the cornerback room versus those other position groups. Looking at the receiver, and this is something I've talked about before, the Packers, if they're going to make an addition, comes in one of two paths. One, they go out and they find and try to add a number one, this is your dude receiver to the offense. The issue with that, there's not a lot of those guys out there, and there certainly aren't a lot of those guys available. The big names that we hear that could potentially fill that role for the Packers are DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, Devontae Adams. And guess what? None of them are free agents right now. They are all still on other teams. So is there draft capital that has to be given up? What's the size of the contract that Brian Gutekunst would have to hand out in those instances while still having to fill other needs on those rosters? And again, as you look to the draft at that wide receiver group, this year's class, depth-wise, high-end talent-wise, it's just not at the same level that I think we've grown accustomed to with recent draft classes, where there is a lot of star-studded potential at the top of those draft classes. So all of those, that reason right there, I think makes it really difficult for the Packers to add to the receiver position, because going out and getting a middle-tier free agent, going out and spending a second, third round pick on the position, I don't think accomplishes what the Packers need. They don't need another number 2 receiver. They don't need another number 3 wide receiver. So it's either really going all in and doing everything you can to get the top of the top option that's out there. And that does go against the grain for how the Green Bay Packers operate. And who knows if those players are even going to be available. Because again, the players we mentioned are still on other teams. They're not free agents. So again, I think the opportunity to add to the receiver in terms of what the Packers need is really small. And the other need at receiver, a vertical presence, well, they're without Christian Watson. But that's not a position, a specific skill set that you necessarily have to invest heavily into, right? That's not someone like you can find that skill set in the middle ladder portion of the draft. You can find that skill set in free agency without breaking the bank. So that's why I don't think necessarily free agency wise, receiver is going to be in play for the Packers. I also don't think it's going to be in play for the defensive line either. And the reason I think that is because this year's draft class is loaded. Tons and tons of talent. Daniel Jeremiah, NFL Network, one of the best in the business, put out his top 50 prospects big board. 14 of them are defensive linemen. Pro Football Focus's big board of their top 100 prospects in this draft, I think 31 of them are defensive linemen. There is talent everywhere in this draft class, and knowing how valuable that is to the Packers from their roster construction approach, I think that's where they're going to go to bolster that position group, because there is a lot of high impact, high end talent that can be found within that draft class. Now we get to cornerback, and I think cornerback, in terms of the opportunity that's there in free agency versus a draft class, that feels like the sweet spot to me in terms of where the opportunity is for the Green Bay Packers to go out and make an addition. Not to say that there isn't, impact players that can be found right away in the draft. Those players are certainly there at the cornerback position, but it's not to the extent where the defensive front is. And also the level of uncertainty that we discussed that the Packers have within their own cornerback room. If they go into the draft not having added anyone in free agency, they are putting themselves in potentially a really, really difficult spot where there isn't any flexibility for them. And flexibility in the draft is king. You do not want to go into the draft saying we have to take this position. That's when you start to reach. That's when you start to deviate from your board. That's where you start to make poor decisions. And so you want to go into the draft with as much flexibility as possible. Obviously, you're going to have your hierarchy of needs that you're going to try to follow, that you're going to try to address, but you don't know how the board's going to fall. You don't know who's going to be available when you're picking, and so you want some flexibility to move around if needed, to trade back, to be able to take a different position group and be okay addressing that position later on in the draft. But if the Packers don't add to their cornerback room in free agency, they're going to be in a tough spot where they're going to be going into the draft thinking, all right, we have to address this position group right away. And again, there's good high impact players that can be found, but not to the extent of the defensive line. So you're really limiting your options to go out and improve that cornerback room if you take that approach. Going back to the free agency side of things, I think there's a lot of good talent that's out there for the Packers. DJ Reed, Charvarius Ward, Carlton Davis, Byron Murphy are all some of the more high-end cornerback options out there on the free agent market. And one name that I really liked that may be a little bit under the radar, Paulson Adebo for the New Orleans Saints. He only played in 7 games last year because of a lower leg injury, but I think he's a really, really good fit for this Jeff Hafley defense. Great ball production, very, very comfortable in man coverage and aggressive cornerback. I think he'd be a really good fit for the Packers. So that's why I think all of those reasons mentioned, I think adds up to, if the Packers are going to take a swing in free agency, it's going to be at the cornerback position. All right, lastly, before we get out of here, something really, really interesting that caught my attention that Brian Gutekunst said during the NFL Combine this week. We all know when it comes to the cornerback position, especially in the draft, that size, length of arms are very much thresholds that the Packers adhere to at the cornerback position, right? Over 190 pounds, ideally over 6 foot tall, right? Long arms. The Packers really, really value those traits at the cornerback position. But something that Brian Gutekunst said that could lead to them altering their approach to a degree in terms of how they evaluate prospects, which prospects in the draft they do look to add to that position, is that Gutekunst said in Jeff Hafley's defense, there's an added emphasis on vision, awareness, and instincts. So compared to past years where it's more of the, those physical traits, right? Height, weight, length, those football instincts may take more priority this year at the cornerback position than what we've seen in the past. So I just thought that was an interesting nugget specifically related to the cornerback position. But as always, we've come to the end here, and I appreciate you tuning in. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. Again, I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Till next time, friends, take care.